Welcome to R&R. Talk about history, philosophy, theology, all that jazz. Today, we're going to talk about our Bibles that we carry around with us everywhere. Everybody pretty much knows the New Testament's written in Greek, the Old Testament's written in Hebrew, a little bit of Aramaic, right? But there was a time when the Old Testament was Greek. So we're going to think about that today. We're going to talk about how the Jews have had a rich history of Hebrew writings, but eventually they conformed to the Greek language. Now, why would they do that instead of following their ancestors' language of Hebrew? That's what we're going to talk about. So the Jews were spread after Babylon's captivity. If you know anything about the Bible, when they were captured, they were spread all throughout the known world, Mediterranean Sea. Yet they maintained their culture, right? And their scriptures were eventually translated into Greek. And this Greek version of the Old Testament is known as the Septuagint, okay? Originally, it was known as the translation of the 70. Today, we use an abbreviation called the LXX. It's Roman numerals for 70, right? So just keep this in mind as we go through this video. You're going to need to remember this. The Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, or the LXX. The Hebrew Old Testament is called the Masoretic text. All right, remember those two, or else you're going to get lost, probably. So yeah, I like to use the Septuagint. I prefer the Septuagint over the Masoretic. Why? Why should we use this Greek version of the Old Testament? That's what we're going to be talking about today. So, yeah. In our last video, we talked about grace. What is grace? Unmerited favor? In a way, in a sense, right? It helps us to accomplish the goal, right? Its influence and its power. The same way that Adam's sin influenced others and celebrities influenced debauchery in society, right? In the same way, the Holy Spirit's grace can influence and empower someone to live godly. Influence is power. So imagine you have this big math test coming up, right? I suck at math, so I'm using math for an example. You can compare this test to Judgment Day, okay? And you know you're gonna fail this test, but your teacher offers you free lessons. He offers you tutoring, free of charge. What a gracious thing for my teacher to do, giving me these free lessons. I didn't have to pay for it. I didn't have to earn it in any way. It was just a gift, simply a gift to me. Now, I still have to apply that tutoring to the test. I still have to work on the test to finish it and pass. I need a passing grade. This is true grace, opposed to the false grace, which says, oh yeah, the teacher, God, just gives you a 100% score on the test, even though you were a failure on it. It's unmerited favor. No, absolutely not. Grace is there to help you complete the test. It's not there to give you a good score on a failed test. That's the difference between the grace that's taught in the American church, Protestantism mostly, and true grace that's biblically and historically taught. That's what we talked about last time. Go watch that if you haven't. Am I pointing the right way? Go watch that if you haven't. I think it was good. So back to the Bible stuff, the Old Testament stuff. Now, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. It's always been in Hebrew. But around 250 BC, 70 rabbis translated the sacred texts into the Greek. And this translation was not a bootleg addiction, homemade DIY translation. No. The project was approved by the high priest and the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. This translation of the 70, the LXX, was an official document. All right. It's a fact that the early Jews used this Greek Old Testament. And the Orthodox Church is the only one that uses it today. The Catholic Bibles and the Protestant Bibles both use Hebrew Old Testament, but the Eastern Church, the Greek Orthodox, have always stayed with the LXX because we're going to prove in this video the LXX is the version that Jesus used, the apostles used, all the early church basically used this one version of the Old Testament. So we're going to talk about that today. There are many attacks on the Hebrew Bible, right? I am one of the people who do not agree with the Hebrew Bible and everything. Many people out there claim that it contains readings that were altered after Jesus' time, and that's true because they were trying to combat the teachings of early Christians. These sections altered prophecies that are applied to Jesus. The Greek Septuagint is more accurate because it doesn't contain these later alterations. The New Testament writers, like I just said, always quote pretty much over 90% of the time, they're quoting from the LXX. They're not quoting from the Hebrew scriptures. And so that's why I believe we should trust it more than we trust the Masoretic text. Right? This is the route we should be taking in our quest to understand the truths of Scripture. So I'm going to quote some early church writings. These are Christians, so you know they're not lying because Christians aren't liars. If you're a liar, a professing Christian, maybe you re-question and examine your faith. So we're going to talk about the history of the Septuagint told from these Christians' perspective. So Theonis Alexandria, 300 AD, he says that he will endeavor to praise the divine scriptures, which with marvelous care and the most generous expenditure Ptolemy Philadelphus caused to be translated into our language. He's saying the LXX that Ptolemy caused to be translated was done with marvelous care. It was not a careless translation. It was very precise, meticulous. It was carefully put together. With generous expenditure. Took a lot of money. This wasn't no DIY thing, like I was saying. This is an important translation in history. Clement of Alexandria, 195 AD, he says that the scriptures, both the law and the prophets, so all the Old Testament, were translated from the language of the Hebrews into the Greek language during the reign of Ptolemy, the son of Lagos. For the Macedonians were still in possession of Asia, and the king was ambitious to adorn his library at Alexandria with all writings. I'm sure you heard of the Library of Alexandria. Huge world wonder, basically, at the time, right? He wanted to fill his library with these writings. I'm going to keep reading here. So he desired the people of Jerusalem to translate the prophecies that they possessed into the Greek language, from Hebrew to Greek, right? And they selected 70 elders from those of highest character among them, and each one individually translated each prophetic book. However, when all the translations were compared together, so this is done by 70 different people. If you get 70 people to make translations of a certain book or books, you're going to get various translations. You're going to get various differences when it comes to because some people translate through interpretation. You have to interpret certain passages in order to translate them. And so when you get different people to translate, you're going to get different translations. Especially, that's why in the Protestant Bibles, there are tons of different translations, which I'm not saying is bad, but I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying you get a lot of different translations. They each have some different interpretations, which is not entirely the best. But anyways, So with this 70, there should be differences within the texts when they are compared together. But if you keep reading, look what he says. However, when they were compared, when all the translations were compared together, they agreed both in meaning and expression. So their interpretations, in the translations, they all agreed with their meaning and expression. If you know about the Greek language, you know that. If you know a little bit about the Greek language, which I don't know that much, I'm not an expert on Greek, but I do know that you can write one sentence in many, many different ways, and the expressions play a big part in how it's read. But all these guys, 70 of them, the expressions lined up and the meaning lined up. That's a miracle. That's not an accident. In order for the meaning to even make sense, the expressions have to make sense. It's there. I'm not about to teach on Greek because I don't know much Greek at all. But basically, there's a miracle, a historical miracle. And as we read the rest of these, you're going to see that. For it was the counsel of God carried out for the benefit of Grecian ears. See, he's saying God was working in this so that the Greeks would have the scriptures. It would be for their benefit. It was not alien to the inspiration of God, who originally gave the prophecy. I'm going to read Justin Martyr, 160 AD. When Ptolemy, king of Egypt, formed a library and sought out to collect the writings of all men, he also heard of these prophets. So he sent to Herod, who was king of the Jews at that time. This is not the same Herod in the New Testament. This is way before that. Requesting that the books of the prophets be sent to him. And Herod the king did indeed send them, written as they were in the Hebrew language. So the scriptures that Herod is sending to Ptolemy are the Hebrew scriptures, right? Now, when their contents were found to be unintelligible to the Egyptians, he sent again and requested that men be commissioned to translate them into the Greek language. And when it was done, the books remained with the Egyptians, where they are until now. They are also in the possession of all the Jews throughout the world. So he's saying, Justin Martyr is saying that at this time he's writing, the LXX translations are still at that library. All the Jews in the known world use that translation. Now, while they were translating these texts, they each had their own cottage that was built. They were quickly built and they were separated from one another, as you will see in these next quotes. Irenaeus, 180 AD. He says, before the Romans possessed their kingdom, while as yet the Macedonians held Asia, Ptolemy the son of Lagos was anxious to adorn the library which he had founded in Alexandria with a collection of writings of all men that were of merit. So he requested that the skilled in the scriptures and in both languages, so those who knew both Greek and Hebrew really well, were to carry out what Ptolemy had desired. However, Ptolemy wished to test them individually, for he feared that they might perhaps, by taking counsel together, conceal the truth of the scriptures by their translation. So he thought, I don't want these guys to start conspiring with one another. I don't want them to hide things that are in the scriptures. I don't want them to say like, hey, we should write this part, we should take out this prophecy, we don't want to offend him with this. So he separated them all. I'm going to read, continuing on now, it says, so he separated them from each other, and he commanded them all to write. He did this with respect to all the books. When they came together in the same place before Ptolemy, and each of them compared his own translation with that of every other, God was indeed glorified, and the scriptures were acknowledged as truly divine, for all of them read out the same translation in the very same words. Again, this was a miracle, and God was glorified that day when Ptolemy saw the translation and said, and acknowledged, wow, These books, these writings are truly divine. LXX was a miracle to the Greeks. Let's keep reading here. Justin Martyr 160 AD. He says, Ptolemy, king of Egypt, had built the library in Alexandria and had filled it by gathering books from every place. He then learned that the very ancient histories written in Hebrew happened to be carefully preserved. And wishing to know their contents, he sent for 70 wise men from Jerusalem and directed them to translate the books. Ordered the construction of as many cottages as there were translators. And he ordered that the officers overseeing this, he ordered the officers overseeing this to prevent any communication of the translators with one another. So when they were in these 70 little cottages, he had a guard on each of them so that they wouldn't talk to each other. When Ptolemy discovered that the 70 men not only had given the same meanings, but had even used the same words, he believed that the translation had been written by divine power. And then he says, personal testimony, he says, men of Greece, this is no fable, this isn't a lie, nor have I narrated something fictitious. Rather, I myself have been in Alexandria, and I have seen the remains of those little cottages at the Pharos, which are still preserved. So yeah, now I'm going to read you Clement of Alexandria, 195 AD. The scriptures were translated into the language of the Greeks, in order that the Greeks might never be able to allege the excuse of ignorance. So he says, from his opinion, right, God had the scriptures translated into Greek so that they won't have an excuse. It's the same thing with us today. You have libraries, you have computers, you have information available at your fingertips. But no one wants to look into Jesus, even though people say, hey, Jesus is the only way. You're going to die without Jesus. You need him for judgment day. You need to be in good standing with God. Because of the evils that you've committed, you need to repent of those. Oh, Jesus was a myth, bro. Jesus was a hippie. Jesus was like Jesus doesn't judge, man. They don't want to look into the truth. And so that's what he's arguing here. He's saying, these guys have the scriptures. God made it available to them so that they'll have no excuse of being ignorant because it's such common knowledge. Hey, the Hebrew scriptures have been translated into Greek. This is a big thing. So anyways, Tertullian, 197 AD, he says, the same account is given by Aristias. So the king left these works, the LXX, unlocked to everybody in the Greek language. To this day, at the temple of Serapis, the libraries of Ptolemy are to be seen, with the identical Hebrew originals in them. The Jews, too, read them publicly. So he's saying, he literally just said that at the time he's writing this, to this day, as I'm writing this, you can see in the Greek library, the Library of Alexandria, you can see this translation and the Hebrew original translations right side by side. And the Jews read them publicly. The Jews used the Greek version. It wasn't a controversial thing. It was a miracle. It was a beautiful thing. And there are way more quotes than this. And as we go through the Bible one day in the future, we're going to read a bunch of these quotes. But this shows you that the LXX, the Septuagint, was seen as divinely inspired writing, done by 70 translators, 72 in some accounts. They all matched up perfectly. And it astonished King Ptolemy to the point where God was glorified because he admitted that these scriptures were divinely inspired. So now we're going to look at that. We're going to look at how the quotes in the Bible, we're going to look at the quotes in the Bible and prove that they don't line up with our Hebrew Old Testament. No, they line up with the Greek Septuagint, whole different manuscript family. So let me show you Jesus and the disciples literally quoting from the Septuagint. Matthew 3, verse 3. It says, verses 2 to 3. John the Baptist is crying out, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. For this who was spoken of by the prophet Isaiah, saying, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, and make his paths straight." Hold on now. He's quoting Isaiah 40, verse 3. And if you go to Isaiah 40, verse 3 in your Old Testament, it sounds different. It says, "A voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." It's a little bit different than prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Because if you look in the Greek version, in the LXX, I have it over here. The LXX, it says the exact same thing that Matthew says. It doesn't mention anything about a desert or a highway. You know, and that's just one little example. Let's go to Acts 8, verse 32. You've probably heard of this great prophecy in Isaiah. It's called Isaiah 53. And it's all about the Messiah being rejected, despised, being sorrowful, being whipped and beaten, and the sins of the world being laid on him. Now, in the book of Acts, Philip is witnessing to an Ethiopian who's reading Isaiah 53, and he's like, "Who is this about?" And Philip says, "Oh yeah, it's about Christ." And it shows a quotation from Isaiah, and it says, "He was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb is silent before his shearers, so he opens not his mouth. In his humiliation, his judgment was taken away. And who will declare his generation? For his life is taken from the earth." Now, in the Hebrew, it doesn't say that. If you go to Isaiah 53, verse 7 to 8, it sounds a little different. It says, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter. As a sheep before his shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth." Pretty similar so far, right? But verse 8, "He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living." Now, it's still pretty much the same meaning, but it's not the same words. This one says, "In his humiliation, his judgment was taken away. And who will declare his generation? For his life is taken from the earth." It's the same meaning, but there's different words used. And Acts 8 quotes the Greek version. So that's just another little one. You need lots of little pieces of evidence in order to make your conclusion. So I'm going to show you some more. Romans 3, verse 10 through 18. I'm not going to read this. I'm not reading all that right now. I'm not trying to waste your time, or I'm not trying to use up all your time. But Romans 3, verse 10 to 18 is a big passage. And if you look at your footnotes, if you have footnotes in your Bible, it's going to say that he's quoting from all these different places, and he's just putting together a little collage. Says he's quoting from Psalm 51, Psalm 14, Psalm 53, Ecclesiastes, Psalm 5, Psalm 10, Isaiah 59. They're making it seem like he's pulling from all these different areas, but he's not. He's quoting from Psalm 14 in the Septuagint, one passage. Not all these different passages. He's quoting one passage. But it's not the same as the Hebrew scriptures. I want you to stay. I mean, you can look at Hebrew. I'm not going to use up all your time, but pause the video and look at Psalm 14 in the Hebrew scriptures. It's not the same as what he says here. Exactly. But if you look at the Greek scriptures, it's exactly the same. I'm going to go to Psalm 14 here in the LXX. That highlighted portion there, I want you now to go back to Romans 3 and follow along with me with what he quotes from verses 10 to 18. I'm going to read the LXX version, the Greek Old Testament of Psalm 14, and look how it says the exact same thing pretty much. There is none, not even one, who does good. The Lord stooped down from heaven to look upon the sons of men, to see if there were any who understood or sought God. All turned aside and were altogether corrupted. There was not even one doing good, no, not one. Their throat is an open tomb. They deal deceptively with their tongues. The poison of serpents is under their lips. That's verse 13 if you're following along in Romans 3. Verse 13, it says, their throat is open tomb. Their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues they practice deceit. The poison of asps, that's snakes, that's serpents, is under their lips. Here in the LXX, it says, they deal deceitfully with their tongues. The poison of serpents is under their lips. Keep following along with me here. Their feet are whose mouth is full of curses and bitterness, and their feet are swift to shed blood. Affliction and suffering are in their ways, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Pretty much word for word. I mean, I don't know how you can argue against that. But yeah, there's none, not even one who does good. The Masoretic text, your Hebrew Old Testament, it doesn't say the same thing. That's why these people who are putting our footnotes think, well, he's getting it from all these other places and making his own statement. No, he's not. He's quoting from Psalm 14. I'll show you one more section in Romans. Romans 11, verse 9. It says, it's quoting David, where it says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a recompense to them. He's quoting Psalm 69, verse 22. But it doesn't say the same thing. No. The LXX is the only one that mentions a stumbling block. So Paul's not quoting from the Hebrew Old Testament. He's quoting from the LXX. He's quoting from the Greek Old Testament. Because only the LXX mentions a stumbling block. Romans 15, verse 12. Again, Isaiah says, there shall be a root of Jesse, and he who shall rise to reign over the Gentiles. In him the Gentiles shall hope. He's quoting Isaiah 11, verse 10. Only the LXX says the Gentiles will hope in him. Let's move on to 1 Corinthians 15, verse 55. I'm going to read verse 54 to 55 to get the context. It says, when this corruptible body has put on incorruption, and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? He's quoting from Hosea 13, verse 14. In the Hebrew, I mean, it's not a huge difference, really, between the Hebrew and the LXX. But in the Hebrew, it's more of a declarative statement. He's declaring something. But in the LXX, it's a rhetorical question. The same way that Paul quotes it to be, like a rhetorical question. That's a slight difference. Hebrews 1:6. But when he again brings the firstborn into the world, he says, let all the angels of God worship him. Now, he's quoting Psalm 97, verse 7. Oh, yeah. So, in Psalm 97:7, the Masoretic text uses the word Elohim, divine beings, gods. But the LXX uses the word angel, which is what Paul says. He's quoting the LXX. I don't know how much more clear it could get. It's a historical fact that the early Christians used the Greek Old Testament. So I'm just showing you so you can see how even Paul is using it. He's never quoting from the Hebrew. But because of this, sometimes people think that these New Testament references are misquoting the Old Testament. No. Our Old Testament has been changed so that it makes the New Testament look like they're misquoting it. All right, Hebrews 2, verse 6-8. It says, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you take care of him? You have made him a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor, and you have set him over the works of your hands, and you have put all things in subjection under his feet. That statement there. You set him over the works of your hands. You subjected all things under his feet. He's quoting Psalm 8, verse 4-6. It's pretty much the same, but verse 7 is clearly a direct quote from the Septuagint. It's one of those minor differences again, but you can see he's quoting from the Greek. Hebrews 8, verse 8-12. I'm not going to read it, but this whole passage here is quoting from Jeremiah 31, verse 31-34. The LXX says he disregarded them. God disregarded the Jews who disobeyed him. But in the Masoretic text, it's changed. In our Hebrew Bibles, it's changed. This is because the Jews who edited it most likely claimed that God would never disregard them. We're his chosen people, right? The Jews. No. See, the Hebrew Old Testament we have in our Bibles today wasn't written by Christians. It was written by people who denied Jesus. We're going to get to that right now. We're going to get to that. But it's going to all make sense why all the prophecies are different, why they're changed, why they don't match up. It's because of these Jews. Hebrews 10, verse 5-7, it says, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin you had no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come. In the volume of the book it is written of me to do your will, O God. And he's quoting Psalm 40, verse 4-8. Now you can read them. I want you to pay attention to sacrifices and offering you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. And Paul is quoting this to say that this is Jesus talking in the Psalms. But the Hebrew text doesn't say a body you have prepared for me. It says, my ears you have opened. See, the Jews changed these scriptures because they didn't want any allusion to the prophecies of Jesus. I'm just making a claim right now that the Jews changed it, but I'm going to show you later how and why. Hebrews 13, verse 6. The Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? He's quoting Psalm 118, verse 6. It's not one of those big differences like the last one. It's more minor differences. The Hebrew says the Lord is on our side, right? The Lord is helping us in the LXX rather than just being on our side. Little difference, but you know. James 4:6. It says, God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. He's quoting Proverbs 3, verse 34. The Masoretic text says, he scorns the scornful. He has contempt for them. He sees them as worthless and despicable. But the LXX says he opposes and resists the arrogant, the prideful, right? And this is the one that Paul quotes. He doesn't quote the one that says that God scorns the scornful. No, he quotes the one that says he opposes and resists the prideful, the arrogant. 1 Peter, I'm going to show you two more, okay, and that's it. You're good to go. I don't want to leave any stone unturned. I want to prove it. All right, so no one can argue with me about this. Because in the future, I'm going to be proving things from the LXX. I don't want to have to re-argue why I believe the LXX. I'm making this video as a general overview. No, making this video to show why it's reliable. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 6 says, Behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect, precious, and he who believes on him will by no means be put to shame. He's quoting Isaiah 28, verse 16. Paul says, believes on him, which is from the LXX. It's not in the Hebrew. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 18, last one. Now, the righteous one is scarcely saved. Where will the ungodly and the sinner appear? He's quoting Proverbs 11, verse 31. Paul says saved. But the Hebrew verse, Paul says saved, just like the Greek LXX. But the Hebrew version says recompense. He's quoting from the Septuagint. He's not quoting from this Hebrew version that we have today. All the quotes that we're seeing are changed. Why are they different? So now, I think I've shown you enough evidence that most of the quotations from the Old Testament that are in the New Testament use the Septuagint as their primary source. The integrity and the truthfulness of the Septuagint is affirmed by the New Testament. There's absolutely no controversy about the integrity of the Septuagint. From 250 BC all the way to 130s, 135 AD. So what happened to provoke dissatisfaction with the Septuagint among the Jews? What made the Jews get all butthurt about it? Because throughout this whole time frame, it was used and accepted by them, and it was read in the synagogues. Yes, early Jews, and they embraced the Septuagint. They read it within synagogues. This translation was highly regarded, and it was widely used in the Jewish diaspora when they were dispersed, especially in Hellenistic, I can't word right now. It was especially highly regarded in Hellenistic areas and Roman territories where the Greek was a common language. I also want to say that it was accessible. It was valued for several reasons, because it made the scriptures accessible in the language that they spoke and they understood. A lot of Jewish people didn't speak Hebrew because of their culture around them. They had to know Greek. It's kind of like, immigrants here in the U.S. My grandparents are Mexican, but I don't know Spanish. I was never taught it. My mom didn't teach me it, even though she's bilingual, because I didn't need to know it. I needed to know English, most importantly, first and foremost, right? And the same thing happened to them. They learned Greek instead of Hebrew, and so they needed a translation where they can actually understand it and read it. And so this bridged the gap between their religious texts and their everyday life. Cultural integration. And so the translation helped integrate Jewish communities into the broader culture while preserving their religious identity. So many early Jewish writers and philosophers like Philo of Alexandria, he, also Josephus, first century historian. Oh, this guy. These guys use the LXX extensively, a lot. And this indicated a significant role in Jewish scholarship and religious life, right? And this practice highlights how, like, its role in religious life and public worship. And the Greek translation made the scriptures acceptable to the Jews who were not fluent in Hebrew. But it is important to say that within different Jewish communities and sects, different philosophies, the LXX was, the opinions on the Septuagint varied. You know, some of them highly regarded it. Some of them thought maybe the Hebrew is more important because it's the original, right? But it wasn't really disregarded or thrown away until later Rabbinic Judaism, after the time of Jesus. They started preferring the Hebrew text over the Greek. So, yeah, later Jewish attitudes, over time, these groups began to distance themselves from the Greek Old Testament, the LXX. And particularly, as Christianity grew and used the Greek translation to support its theological arguments about Jesus, Rabbinic Judaism eventually emphasized the Hebrew text more than the usage of the Septuagint. So they said Masoretic over LXX. Various historical sources provide evidence of the Septuagint's significance. For example, the letter of Aristeas, a Hellenistic era document, describes the translation's creation and its reception in high regard. So it wasn't just the Christian writers that we read earlier, it was also this guy, Aristeas, his writings, his letter, my bad. So, yeah, the Christians began to skillfully prove to the Jews that Jesus was, in fact, the promised Messiah of the Old Testament. And they used the Septuagint to do it, because the Septuagint, the Greek, is far more precise than the Hebrew. You know, for example, right, there's a prophecy in Isaiah 7 about Christ being born of a virgin. Now, in the Hebrew, the language is more fluid, it has different meanings. Virgin, that word, could mean young woman. It doesn't necessarily mean someone who's never had sex. But in the LXX, in the Septuagint, that word only means virgin. So the Jews at that time, when they were translating the Greek Septuagint, they understood this to be, oh, this is someone who's never had sex who's going to have the Messiah, a special woman. And you can't argue with the Greek Old Testament because it's so precise in its meaning. And so the Jews who rejected Jesus were saying, wow, that's true. But we don't want to believe this Jesus guy. I mean, let's just go back to the Hebrew, because the Hebrew, it could just mean woman, young woman, right? So they started doing that. The Christians were using the Septuagint to prove the Messiah, because the Greek translation had precise meanings And the translation was perfect, and historically it was a miracle, right? In and of itself, because God was guiding the translators so the Gentiles could one day read these. And so as Christianity grew, Rabbinic Judaism distanced itself from the Septuagint. And by the 2nd century, which is like the 100 years after Jesus, Jewish leaders emphasized the Hebrew text, the Masoretic tradition, over the Greek. So the reasons they claim they did this was that they said it was a desire to maintain a distinct Jewish identity, right? They were concerned over the inaccuracies or the interpretive differences of the Greek translation. But there were no inaccuracies. They couldn't handle the clear prophecies which were about Jesus, so they just changed it. Their goal was to twist scripture like Satan did, because everyone who denies Christ as the Messiah is of the devil. You know, Annas and Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin had rejected the messianic claims of Jesus. The New Testament documents had been written and were circulating by 70 AD. Like by that time, 70 AD, you had all of Paul's letters. You had the Gospels besides John. And so all the Christian writings were circulating the areas. And the Jews knew the credibility of the Christian Gospels depended on the credibility of the Septuagint, because it quotes the Septuagint. The New Testament quotes the Old Testament translations from the LXX. And so now that I've kind of given you a long explanation, I know this is a super long video, but I'm trying to teach you this so you know what it's saying. I want to talk about a man named Rabbi Akiva. Now, Rabbi Akiva's influence on Judaism is just absolutely profound. Right, he was born into a poor family. He began his study of the Torah pretty late in life, when he was like in his 40s. He rose from a shepherd to a leading scholar and had remarkable dedication and intellect, right? And he contributed to the Talmud in some ways. So he's credited contributing to the Mishnah significantly because he organized and compiled oral traditions into a coherent structure. And his interpretations and his teachings were foundational for later rabbinic literature, including the Talmud. So the Jewish, the rabbinic Judaism that we see today, a lot of it comes from Rabbi Akiva. Super foundational for this later rabbinic literature. All right? It all starts with this guy. And so Akiva is known for his method of interpreting the Torah, right? He interprets it, I mean, both literally and allegorically, but he used a principle called Gezerah Shava, an interpretive analogy, and Binyanav, and general principles. He used principles such as interpretive analogy and general principles to derive legal rulings and theological insights. I want to give you all the context. I'm trying to teach you history here. This is a history class. It's not necessarily all biblical stuff only. It's history because we use history to interpret the Bible, right? It's a tool to interpret properly. I want to talk about the Bar Kochba Revolt. Rabbi Akiva supported Simon Bar Kochba, Simon, son of Kochba. And his relationship with Simon Kochba, the leader of the revolt against Roman rule, was one of supposed prophecy, right? He believed that Simon, this guy, was the Messiah. So Akiva saw Simon as the messianic figure who would redeem Israel by leading the Jewish people to political and spiritual redemption. He would redeem Israel by leading this Jewish people into a political redemption, a spiritual redemption from Roman oppression. And so Akiva's endorsement was significant because he was a leading scholar, right? Akiva was a leading scholar and he was an authoritative figure. So his support to Simon gave a lot of weight to Simon's claim that he was the Messiah. And he galvanized many Jews to join this revolt, right? I'm not going to talk about all of it, but basically in the aftermath of that whole rebellion, the Bar Kochba Revolt, it began in 132 AD, so about 30 years after the Apostle John died. And initially, he achieved some success. However, the revolt was ultimately crushed by the Romans. I mean, crushed with brutal force. And the defeat led to widespread devastation in Judea and severe consequences for the Jewish people, which shows that his faith for this Simon Kochba guy, that he was the Messiah, the supposed Messiah, right? It was all in vain. Because only Jesus is King Messiah. Only Jesus. And so he had this false Messiah. He had a false Messiah. And can you shut up, please? Thank you. His legacy, but his legacy is also marked by his martyrdom. Because after the failure of that revolt, Akiva was captured by the Romans and he was executed. And despite the revolt's failure, despite the fault, he realized this was a false Messiah that he believed in. Rabbi Akiva's martyrdom further cemented his legacy as this figure of unwavering faith and dedication to Jewish ideals. Their faith in this Messiah was strengthened even more, even though he failed miserably. He didn't deliver them, maybe for a short period, but not in the long run. He failed. But this fulfills exactly what Jesus said. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not accept me. But if someone else comes in his own name, you'll accept him. That's John 5:43. So Rabbi Akiva's impact on Jewish law and mysticism and thought remains influential to this day, which is why he's a central figure in rabbinical Jewish history. And so, yeah, now having all of that context of who this guy was and everything, we're going to get back to the main issue. Remember, the Christians were using the LXX to prove Christianity. Because of the language, it was more precise than the Hebrew, right? And it showed that the 70 translated it. The Jewish view of the Messiah, it shows that the 70 who translated the Septuagint, their view of the Messiah was the same as Christianity's view. He'd be born of a virgin, right? So around the time that John was on Patmos writing Revelation, Rabbi Akiva was planning a new translation of the scriptures. Around 95 AD, Rabbi Akiva, before he ever proclaimed Simon Bar Kochba as the Messiah, right? Way before he ever did that, he hired a man named Aquila to translate a Hebrew version of the Old Testament from the Greek, right? And that would undermine the messianic claims of Jesus found in the Septuagint. Now, some scholars believe that the Masoretic text, the Bibles we have, our Old Testament here, was based in part on this translation by Aquila. So the Hebrew version we have today, some scholars believe that it goes back all the way to this Aquila guy who was hired by this leading rabbinical leader who had a false Messiah. Anyways, this guy Aquila who translated it, In later Jewish literature, Aquila's translation is sometimes referred or referenced, and he is noted for his contributions to Jewish scholarship. But details about his life and the full extent of his influence aren't really well documented. We don't really know that much. But we're going to see what the early Christians had to say about this. All right, so now to the main meat of this teaching. How is the Masoretic text different from the Septuagint? I'm going to put a list up of some more differences between the LXX and the Septuagint, just so you can go and look at them. So we get the Masoretic text is part of a tradition that began with Rabbi Akiva. And rabbis rewrote the Jewish Bible in different sections, perhaps to destroy the credibility of the New Testament. This is speculation so far. But now I'm going to show you early church quotes. All right. Because we're 2,000 years in the future. What do we know? I'm going to show you what they said about Aquila and this translation. All right. Jesus and his followers quoted from the Septuagint, Old Testament, over 90% of the time, and it soon became the Old Testament of the church. That's why the Orthodox Church still uses it. The Jews eventually discontinued using it, preferring the 2nd century translation made by a Jewish convert, Aquila. Septuagint was the Old Testament for the Christians, and then Aquila made them a new Old Testament just for the Jews in Hebrew. Here are some early church quotes. All right. Irenaeus of Lyon, in his book Against the Heresies, Irenaeus argues against these non-Septuagint translations. He critiques Aquila for not maintaining the theological depth found in the Septuagint, and he emphasizes the importance of the Septuagint's divine inspiration, suggesting that other translations fall short. The Septuagint was a miracle. And he says, "It is not as some allege. Behold, a young woman will conceive and bring forth a son. As Theodotion the Ephesian has interpreted it, and Aquila of Pontus, both of whom are Jewish proselytes." So he mentions that proselyte just means convert. So he says that Theodotion the Ephesian and Aquila of Pontus, he says that they interpret it to say young woman, but it is not as these people allege it to be. All right. Irenaeus also said in the same book, "But since the scriptures have been interpreted with such fidelity by the 70 elders who were with Ptolemy, and since they have obtained the authority of being held in all honor, why should we seek anything else? Why should we not acquiescence in them?" So the Septuagint I showed you is so much of a miracle. It's highly regarded. It was God's way of reaching the Gentile world. Why should we look for anything else? Why should we go to a Hebrew version and a retranslation of it when we have what was already a miracle by God? That's what he's arguing. Justin Martyr, in his dialogue with Trypho, he says, he criticizes Aquila also. And he criticizes the translation as being influenced by Jewish interpretations in order to counter the Christian readings. So he says, "For you translate these scriptures as you please, and in various manners. But the right reading, I am persuaded, is that of the 70 interpreters." So they translated according to their own interpretations and their selfish ambitions to counter Christians by corrupting the text. Justin Martyr, in his dialogue with Trypho, he also says, he starts to suggest that the Jewish translators like Aquila have altered the text to obscure references to Christ. We literally saw this when we looked at the quotations in the Old Testament. And he argues that these translators were made to prevent Jews from converting to Christianity. And he implies that Aquila's motives and accuracy were not precise. He criticizes Aquila. Chapter 68, he says, "For they dared, and still dare, to remove entire passages from the scriptures, as I can prove to you from these writings. For from the saying," so he's proving from the Septuagint that Aquila and his Hebrew translation are removing certain parts that are in the Greek. "For from these sayings of the same Jeremiah, these have been cut out, so that they might say the passage refers to Hezekiah, as I have already stated, who was born of a virgin. But I am far from putting reliance in your Jewish teachers, who refuse to admit that our interpretation made by the 70 elders who were entered with Ptolemy of the Egyptians is a correct one. Remember, it was a miraculous work of God. Aquilas was not. Aquilas was just his own interpretation, his own translation. I want you to observe what they, the Jews, have altogether taken away many scriptures from the translations affected by those 70 elders who were with Ptolemy, and by which this very man who was crucified is proved to have been set forth expressly as God and man." So, yeah, the 70, their translation proved that Christ, who was crucified, is both God and man. Origen, 228 AD, he says, "I have compared our own copies with theirs." He's comparing the Septuagint LXX with Aquila's translation, the Hebrew. "I have compared our own copies with theirs, that have the confirmation of the versions never subjected to corruption of Aquila, Theodotion, and Simantius." So he mentions 3 people. 2 of them were mentioned earlier in the quote that we read, Aquila and Theodotion. He mentions Aquila and says their version is subject to corruption. Ours is not. We stick to the original. I'm not saying to agree with everything Origen said, but I'm just saying he acknowledges that it was corrupted. So do with that what you will, right? Origen also says that Aquila, following the Hebrew readings, gives it in this manner: "He has obtained a reputation among the Jews for having interpreted the scriptures with no ordinary care. His version is most commonly used by those who do not know Hebrew, being the one that has been most successful." So Aquila was using the ignorance of others who don't know Hebrew to trick them. This is the whole reason why God led those 70 to translate it in a special way, so that the Greek people who didn't know Hebrew, the Jews who spoke Greek and didn't know Hebrew, would not have an excuse. They'd be able to know what it says. But Aquila was using their ignorance to let things slide and translate things the way they weren't supposed to be translated. So yeah. Epiphanius of Salamis, in his writing Panerodon, he criticizes Aquila for his Jewish background and the literal translation methods which he believes distort the meaning of the scriptures. So, Epiphanius of Salamis on weights and measures. Chapter 16. Aquila, who translates the Hebrew scriptures from the Greek, was faithful to the words but often missed the meaning. His rendering of Isaiah 14, for instance, as a young woman instead of virgin, obscures the prophecy of the virgin birth of Christ. So, after all that, having concluded all that, why don't I trust the Hebrew over the LXX? Because some scholars believe that the Masoretic text was based partially by Aquila's translation. And it became a thing where the Jews wanted to get back to the Hebrew, right? Irenaeus, 180 AD. The apostles are more ancient than all these heretics. And they agree with this aforesaid translation, the LXX. And the translation harmonizes with the tradition of the apostles. For Peter, John, Matthew, and Paul, and the rest in turn, as well as their followers, quoted all prophecies just as the interpretation of the elders contains them. Do you see that? Paul, Matthew, Peter, John, they quote all the prophecies just like the 70 interpreted them in the LXX, just how the Septuagint contains them. Not like these heretics who change it. Why are we using a Hebrew Old Testament and saying that it's more highly regarded than there's no doubt that a handful of readings in the Hebrew manuscripts, the Masoretic text, they've been altered at some point, and there are differences. And so I don't claim that our Hebrew Old Testament is 100% infallible, right? I rely on the Greek Septuagint more than I rely on this Hebrew one at certain points, because sometimes the New Testament did quote the Hebrew, so I'm not going to throw it out entirely. That's just ridiculous. But I am going to hold the Greek version in higher esteem than the Hebrew. Yeah, this version that we use is the same that the Jews, the Rabbinic Jews, use. It's called the Masoretic text. Now, it was compiled together around 700 AD, and it's almost 1,000 years newer than the Septuagint. The rabbis who compiled the Masoretic text were not accountable to the high priest in Jerusalem. There was no longer a high priest. The rabbis who compiled the Masoretic text weren't being held accountable by a Sanhedrin court, right, in Jerusalem, because there is no longer a Sanhedrin. So I'm going to trust the Greek Old Testament, which was approved by a whole Sanhedrin court and by the authority of Jerusalem, right, over this Masoretic text that came 1,000 years later. The Septuagint predates the first appearance of the Masoretic text by almost 10 centuries. I want to go to the earliest source. I want the LXX. I don't want the Masoretic. Rabbi Akiva, who had a false messiah who failed, hired Aquila to translate and misconstrued the Old Testament from the Greek into a Hebrew version that would undermine the messianic claims of Jesus that are found in the Septuagint. And the Masoretic text began to evolve from there. That's where it all started. And then now we have what we have today. I'm not trying to make you hate your Hebrew version and get rid of it. I'm not saying that. I still read from here. I'm just saying that there are parts in it that have been twisted, taken out, and corrupted. And there's no way to argue against what I just said. It's just a fact. I've shown you. And so there's a playlist, a Septuagint playlist by Refute It. I'm going to link that here. He has some good videos on it that are more visual. So yeah. Now that I've established that, I'm going to be going back to this point a lot in my future videos. So now that you know, I want to move on to just a question that some of you curious people might have. Why is the Masoretic text in our Bibles? Why don't we have the Greek version in our Bibles? Now, as we talked about earlier, for centuries, the LXX continued to be accepted by the church, and as Christianity spread westward, the need increased for a reliable Latin translation of the scriptures about 380 AD. So this is where you get into church history about how the East always kept the Greek, but as the church spread, they needed Latin. So there's a manuscripts of Latin, there's like the Catholic manuscripts, and we call them the Codex Vaticanus. And then you got the Greek manuscripts called the received text. This might be a lot right now, but we'll learn it slowly as time progresses. Now, Catholics at this time, Jerome, began a project to translate the entire Bible into Latin. And Jerome began by translating the New Testament, and then the Psalms, and progress continued. Now, Augustine, you ever heard of St. Augustine? That guy told Jerome to translate the Old Testament from the LXX rather than the present day Hebrew sources, because Augustine understood that the Greek Old Testament is far more important than the Jews who don't even believe in Jesus, their manuscript. Why would we want their manuscripts? So this is what he said: I beseech you not to devote your labor to the work of translating into Latin the sacred canonical books, unless you let it be seen plainly what differences there are between this version of yours, the Hebrew, and that of the Septuagint, whose authority is worthy of highest esteem. That's what Augustine said to Jerome in 394 AD. So, but Jerome persisted to translate the Hebrew. That's really stupid. But aided by the Pope's political clout, Jerome's Latin Vulgate became the predominant Bible version that was used throughout all the Western world. Not in the Eastern world, because they still use the Greek Old Testament, but in all the Western churches, Catholicism, Protestantism, right? The Hebrew translation became the most widespread. So yeah, and although the Eastern churches continued using the LXX, their influence declined. The LXX mostly faded from memory between the 7th and 11th century. So yeah, the oldest extant manuscripts of the Masoretic text date from the 9th century AD. That's over 1,000 years after the LXX. Since the Reformation in the 16th century, there has been a rediscovery of the LXX among the Christian community, right? Because we started reading early Christian writings, and we've started having a more interest in the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery. And so because of that, this generated increased attention to the LXX. We started to realize how important that is over the Hebrew one that we have. So in my conclusion, this super long video, in my conclusion, your Old Testament is the Masoretic text that was written and begun around the 6th century, and it's compiled in the 10th century by scholars at Talmudic academies. But this text only dates back to the 10th century, nearly 1,000 years after the time of Christ. And it's not even done by Christians, it's done by Jews who deny Jesus. This Hebrew version we have in our Protestant Bible and the Catholic Bible is not what early Christians would use. The early Christians were against this version of the Old Testament. And I don't want to say it's corrupt, but it has been altered and perverted. I'm not saying it's altered to the point where you shouldn't read it anymore. Of course, I'm not saying that. And I'm not saying you have to buy a Greek Old Testament. You don't have to do that. I still read from the Hebrew text. But It isn't what the early Christians used, and it shouldn't be trusted over the Greek scriptures. So that's why I'm going to refer back to this video in the future. And that's why I trust the Greek more than the Hebrew. Because it comes 1,000 years later. Why am I not going to trust the Septuagint? If there are differences in the text, I'm choosing the Greek Septuagint 100% of the time. So when I use the LXX in future videos, I'll reference back to this one. I know it was long. Thanks for sticking with me. This is for your own benefit so you can know. I know it seems unnecessary, but it's not. Because I'm going to make a lot of arguments in the future. Because the LXX helps prove the truth. You start with the basis of truth. What are the right scriptures? The Hebrew one or the Greek one? The Greek one. So the Greek one's where I'm going to draw my theology from. Because the Greek one helps prove that the Messiah is Christ. It actually helps prove the Trinity more, that are greater than this Hebrew version. So, yeah, for those of you that watched, the 2 people that watched probably, thank you for watching. Appreciate it. God bless you. And yeah, be safe out there.